Ladies, gents, and NBs, we have arrived at the end of 2022, and it has been a fun ride. Aside from saying that if my channel has brought you a lot of joy in 2022, then joining my Patreon would be a wonderful Christmas present. Let's talk about my top 10 books in translation of 2022. These books were all published this year, and they are all fiction. Number 10 is Ghost Town by Kevin Chen, translated from Mandarin by Darryl Stirk. Darryl Stirk is one of the best translators in the business. His translation of this novel, as with every novel he works on, is stellar. Ghost Town is a complex literary novel that explores the concept of ghosts in a lot of different ways. We use the term ghost to mean a lot of different things, and that's what Kevin Chen is playing on here. To start with, our protagonist is a young man from a small town in central Taiwan, which has kind of become a ghost town as people have gradually left to find better jobs or university or family, whatever. He is the youngest son of a large family, and several years ago he left for Germany because he knew he was gay and he knew he had to get out and find a place that might be kinder to him. But while he was in Germany, he fell in love with a young man and somehow managed to kill him. And he has spent several years in prison. Now he's coming back to his hometown. His memories haunt him, his family haunts him, and there's also a literal ghost festival going on in the town, and that's why all of the family members are reconvening. This is a brutal novel about the ways in which our families do us harm, the scars of youth, the scars of parenthood, what it's like growing up different, what it's like growing up isolated. There are obviously mysteries to unpack. There are journeys that the novel takes us on through both time and space, as we journey from country to country, and year to year, and perspective to perspective. There's a lot going on here in a pretty small literary novel, and Ghost Town has really stuck with me in the months since I read it. I loved it. Number 9 is The Age of Doubt. This is a collection of 6 stories by one of South Korea's most legendary authors, Park Kyung-lee. Each of the 6 stories is translated by a different translator. And these stories are about a very specific time and place. Park Kyung-lee was born during the Japanese occupation of Korea. She lived through World War II, she lived through the Korean War, and she was writing about these things. She was writing about what South Korea looked like post-World War II, post-Korean War, during a slew of dictatorships. And her stories are about people. Specifically, they're about emotion. Every strong and powerful emotion that we feel is explored here in some way in these stories. Love and loss and grief and anger and frustration, pain, all of these things are front and center. The stories differ in length as well, and we're seeing a lot of life. One of the stories is heavily inspired by her own childhood, and you learn a lot about Korea at this time, about 70, 60 years ago. You're seeing the aftermath of multiple wars and life within a dictatorship. So this is a snapshot of life that doesn't exist anymore. And rather than it being about big government conspiracies or warfare, it's just about people, about ordinary people living their lives. And this makes the list for 2 reasons. One, they're wonderful stories, translated by very talented translators. And 2, she is a legendary writer. The importance of this collection of stories really cannot be understated. Overstated? Overstated. I'm a little bit sick. Overstated. Yes. Good. She is a cherished writer, and Honford Star, the publisher, gathered together some of the best Korean to English translators working today to bring us a collection of her stories written post-World War II and post-Korean War. This is very special. Number 8 is Paradise by Fernanda Melchor, translated from the Spanish by Sophie Hughes. This is a Mexican novel by one of the most daring contemporary authors we have. Paradise is an uncomfortable story. It's really, really short. I read it in a single day, and I think about it a lot. Paradise is set in a rich collection of homes, sort of a gated community, and we have 2 young male protagonists. One is a rich boy who lives in one of these fancy condos, and the other is a poor boy who works on the land as kind of a dog's body, keeping the place clean. They're both terrible people in their own way, and they are unlikely friends simply because they're of the same age and they happen to both just be around. The rich boy is a sadistic and creepy pervert, and the poor boy is kind of similar, but in different ways. This is a gritty, nasty, gnarly, upsetting little novel, and it examines the ways in which our environments shape us. It asks really big questions about nature versus nurture, about our circumstances, our class, our economic status, and how those things craft us and mold us. But it's also a book about toxic masculinity. This is a book by a woman where the two protagonists are aggressive young boys, and we're looking at why they behave the way that they do, in spite of the fact that they're from very different economic backgrounds. One is very privileged and really has no problems in his life. The other is abused and downtrodden by his family, by his boss, and he has no money. They're both malicious, dark, horrible, twisted people, and they don't treat each other with any more kindness than they do anyone else. It's a really difficult novel to read. Thankfully, it's brief, and I don't know how well I'm actually selling it, but Paradise is so incredibly smart and so incredibly brutal. It's a fantastic example of a book that makes you uncomfortable and is a difficult read, but is absolutely worthwhile. I truly believe in reading books that make us uncomfortable if they're going to teach us something that is important to know, if they're going to challenge our perspectives on certain themes or certain political ideas, etc., etc. I really believe in doing that. As long as you can bear it, as long as your mental health can stand it, then go for it. And go for Paradise. Number 7 is All the Lovers in the Night by Mieko Kawakami, translated as always from the Japanese by Sam Bett and David Boyd. I mentioned in my original review that we are so lucky that every year for the past 3 years, we've received a Mieko Kawakami novel, translated by that same incredible translation team. While Breasts and Eggs remains my favourite Mieko Kawakami novel, her books are always going to appear somewhere on my top 10. She's remarkable, and All the Lovers in the Night is arguably her most thematically and tonally subtle novel. Her books are quite often pretty straightforward in terms of what they're about. All the Lovers in the Night had me thinking a little harder. It tells the story of a 30-something-year-old woman called Fuyuko. She used to work in publishing, and now she works freelance as a proofreader. That's her whole job. She sits at home, and she's sent manuscripts that she has to proofread. The person who sends her these books is kind of a socialite, and the two of them talk work, but they also try to socialize. Fuyuko doesn't like going out very much. She doesn't like to drink alcohol. She has absolutely no hobbies or interests at all. She works, she eats, and she sleeps. That's her life. She's not depressed, I guess, but certainly not really alive either. She just goes through the motions, living the bare bones of a life. And this colleague of hers, Hijiri, is an extroverted, opinionated woman who likes to go out to bars and drink. And Fuyuko occasionally goes out with her and tries to live a more expected life. In many ways, this reminded me of Convenience Store Woman, one of my favourite novels ever. A book about people who live slightly differently, outside of the status quo, outside of what is expected, outside of what is normal, and the ways in which they are just confusing to other people. I found Fuyuko such a fascinating character in terms of her relatability, because on the one hand, as someone who has a lot of hobbies and interests, and spends most of her time doing fun stuff, I couldn't relate to Fuyuko at all. The idea of just working, eating, and sleeping is confusing to me. On the other hand, she's pretty autistic coded, and as a neurodiverse person, I understood her attitude to life. I understood her attitude to other people. I understood the ways in which she just seemed like a confusing outlier. This is such a quiet and subtle novel compared to Mieko Kawakami's other works. And for that reason, I found it a challenge, but a very welcome one. I wanted to be challenged by this novel. I wanted to be challenged by Fuyuko, and by the themes and ideas and motifs that were presented here. It's a fascinating and very delicate Japanese novel, and I'm so glad that we have something that really demonstrates the breadth of Kawakami's approaches to life and art and literature and people. It's a fascinating book. Now, I just mentioned Convenience Store Woman, which was written by my other favorite Japanese author, Sayaka Murata, and my number 6 book is Life Ceremony. This is Sayaka Murata's short story collection. The stories were all translated by Jini Tapley Takimori, and these stories represent a kind of bridge between Sayaka Murata's Convenience Store Woman, which is a pretty grounded and relatable story, and Earthlings, a frightening novel. Something that you might not consider a piece of horror, but certainly something that disturbs and makes us uneasy. At this point, both of these novels are legendary in the Japanese literary canon, and in spite of them being thematically quite similar, they're incredibly different things, and Life Ceremony sits between the two. A lot of the themes, story beats, and even the characters mentioned within these stories are very reminiscent of Earthlings. And I said in my review that it seems as though a lot of these stories were written prior to Earthlings and represent like a beta test of the themes and characters and stories in that novel. There are prototypes of ideas that are fleshed out in Earthlings. And then there are also very original ideas as well. And just like Earthlings, the stories in Life Ceremony explore really frightening things like cannibalism. A lot of the stories involve one of two scenarios. A world in which a really terrifying thing that we would never do as a society has become normalized, and within that story there is a person who doesn't like it and is seen as weird for not liking the scary thing that's now normal, or our ordinary world and there's someone who's doing the weird thing and is therefore an outlier for doing that. And when you compare those two scenarios that are both repeated throughout this collection, it makes you think about taboos. It makes you think about what is normal, about what is expected of us, about what is okay, and why. Why our morals and our religions teach us certain things about right and wrong, about what is okay, about what is not. Sayaka Murata looks at these things from two different angles that make you reconsider them in some really fun and daring ways. She is probably my favorite Japanese author, and with Life Ceremony, she is taking the things that she has now been established as a writer of, and just mixing them up a little bit, experimenting with her repeated themes of outsiders and society being a strange, homogenized place, and the taboos that push us further from society. She works on these themes again and again and again from different angles throughout this collection. I love it so much. The most celebrated South Korean author of today is probably Kyung-Suk Shin, and my number 5 book is her newest novel, Violets, translated by my friend Anton He. Violets is an expressly feminist story. We begin with a young girl who has a best friend, and they live in a small village in rural Korea. They share an intimate lesbian moment, and our protagonist feels something genuine, and the other girl pushes her away and feels frightened and disturbed and runs off. And that's the end of the prologue. Then, we're following our protagonist living in Seoul in her early 20s, where she unexpectedly takes a job at a florist. After having tried working at a hair salon and is looking to get into a big corporate world, but she ends up as a florist. She makes a friend. She wonders about what happened to her childhood friend. And this novel basically explores the male gaze versus the female gaze, the ways in which women look at each other, the ways in which women befriend each other, and even recruit each other in a professional or corporate setting, versus the way that men treat women. It really has you thinking about the very subtle and nuanced, almost invisible ways in which men treat women abusively. Ways that are completely normalized, that we don't even think about these days. Something that I think about a lot, and I've made a TikTok about, is that when a woman walks down the street, quite often a man expects her to just move out of the way from him as he barrels forward. Things like this we don't talk about enough, and Violets explores all of it. And I absolutely love it for that. Number 4 is Jawbone. This is written by Monica Ojeda, who is an author from Ecuador, and it was translated from the Spanish by Sarah Booker. This is a horror-tinged literary novel. It's twisted and scary in some really creative ways. We have a group of rich young girls who spend some of their time hanging out in an abandoned building where they pretend to do ritualistic things, worshipping this white god that they've created. Meanwhile, two of them, the two main girls of this group, are engaging in some lesbian activities. And then you have their teacher, a woman who was heavily traumatized and upset by her previous job at a different school, where some young girls abused her, and she is now abusing these young girls in turn. Because when the book begins, one of these girls that hangs out in an abandoned building and worships a fake god has been kidnapped by this teacher and taken to a cabin in the woods and tied up for some reason. This is a story about those girls and what they get up to, about that teacher, what she went through in the past, and what she's doing now in the present. It's a very remarkable story. I don't really want to tell you too much. You can go watch my review if you want more, but I feel like leaving you in the dark here. It has a cult sensibility to it, not just in the fact that it's kind of a little bit about a cult-ish, but also because it just feels like punk cult fiction. This is exactly what punk literature feels like to me. I've talked in the past about punk literature and what I mean by that. You can track down that video if you like, but I read a lot of books I would describe as punk, and Jawbone is absolutely a shining example of that. Top 3 time. My number 3 book is Solo Dance by Lee Kotomi, translated by my dear, darling, delightful, dashing friend Arthur Reiji Morris. I've said this before and I'll say it again, I'm so proud of Arthur. This is his debut literary translation, and it is one of my favourite books of this year. The fact that one of my best friends translated one of my favourite books of this year is a really special thing. Solo Dance is a novel about a Taiwanese person who lives in Japan, written by a Taiwanese person who lives in Japan and writes in Japanese, and translated her own book back into Mandarin when it was published in Taiwan. But this is a very, very dark and difficult novel. It is about depression, it is about queerness, and it is about the unfortunate overlap between those two things, based on bigotry and bullying and abuse. When she was growing up in Taiwan, when she was at university in Taipei, our protagonist went through something very, very traumatic, very dark and frightening, and we don't learn what it is for a little while. But now, she is working a corporate job in Tokyo, she's been there for a few years, and she is very, very depressed and obsessed with death, and obsessed with writers who romanticize and talk and write about death a lot. Especially Cho Miao-jin, who wrote Notes of a Crocodile, and killed herself. Our protagonist has come to a point where she is romanticizing death. She is queer, she is haunted by her past, she does not feel good about her future. And I read this novel at a moment in the middle of this year when I was at the lowest point I think I've ever been at in my life. I have struggled with depression in the past, and I hit a bout of depression this year that paralyzed me. I did not know what to do with myself. I am now in a wonderful place. I feel great. I went on antidepressants. I feel wonderful. But at that moment, things were bad. And I read a book about things getting bad, which can be either a very dangerous thing to do or a very cathartic and empathetic thing to do. For me, it was the latter. I don't recommend this wholly to anyone who's struggling with depression, but it worked on me in a sense. It didn't help with my depression, but it was a companion through it. And I am very grateful to this novel for that. So thank you to Lee Kotomi, and thank you to Arthur. My number 2 book was kind of a surprise. I didn't expect this book to end up so high on the list, but I loved it so much. And that is Diary of a Void by Emi Yagi, translated by David Boyd and Lucy North. This is a Japanese novel about a young woman who works at a generic office in Tokyo, and she is bored and frustrated by the fact that as the only woman in the office, she is treated as a dog's body. She has to make the tea and the coffee for all of the men, and eventually she's had enough, and she makes up a lie and says, "Oh, I can't do this anymore, I can't stand the smell of coffee because I'm pregnant." And she's not pregnant, but now everyone starts treating her differently. Her life gets better, and she has to keep up this lie. And the story goes down some strange, hilarious, and sometimes dark avenues. I don't really think I need to tell you any more. Diary of a Void is a short novel. It is funny, it is entertaining, it is strange, it is exciting, and is very aggressively feminist. As with every book I've mentioned on this list, there is a dedicated review, so go watch my review of Diary of a Void, and you'll see why it's my number 2 book. I've lent this book to several friends who've all enjoyed it just as much as me, and I need to make sure that as many people read Diary of a Void as possible. Unlike my number 2 book, my number 1 book really shouldn't be a big surprise, and that is Our Share of Night by Mariana Enriquez, translated from the Spanish by Megan McDowell. Mariana Enriquez is one of my favourite authors. Alongside Selva Almada, she is my joint favourite Argentinian author, and her first 2 short story collections that we have in English have become a part of my soul. But up until now, that's all we had, was 2 collections of short stories. And then we skip the part where she writes an ordinary length novel, because Our Share of Night is an enormous epic, a huge brick of a book that is one of the smartest pieces of fiction I've ever read. In some ways, it is a Lovecraftian cult thing. In other ways, it feels kind of Americana in a Stephen King way. But it's also a very uniquely Argentinian novel, very specifically about the country's political and economic situation through the 70s, 80s, and 90s. This is a true epic novel. It is brilliantly, sharply political. It is a horror novel, but it takes horror down different streets. As I said, there are Lovecraftian cult elements, there are very Stephen King-inspired moments, and the horror even seeps into the themes and ideas which, as I've said, are very intensely political and economic and social. This is a novel about a man and his son, who both have the power to contact an eldritch god, and are used as tools by a powerful cult that actually spans the entire planet to try to reach this god, sacrifice to it, worship it, and gain or maintain their power and status. This is about the rich versus the poor. This is about powerful people, politicians, wealthy people, CEOs, whatever, the powerful, manipulating and draining dry people and treating them like they are resources and tools and weapons. It is a fiery and powerful political novel, but it's also a frightening Lovecraftian horror story. And it's a huge epic that took me a full week to read. Our Share of Night is an absolute masterpiece. And I've loved so many great works in translation this year. I've talked about 10 of them here, and I think this is the one that I would very confidently call a masterpiece. It's a word we throw around a lot these days, but Our Share of Night is a true Latin American horror, literary fiction masterpiece. What a book. What a book. I've got a friend who lives in Chile who has read it 3 times. That's wild. But she's got amazing taste and it says a lot. Our Share of Night is perfect. It's perfect. There you go. That is my top 10 books in translation from 2022. I really hope you enjoyed that. Again, if you love my channel, if you've enjoyed it through this year, consider subscribing to my Patreon. And subscribe for books.